A $100 bill says $100 on the face of it, but in the checkout lanes and at the gas pumps, it no longer seems to finish the jobs it was printed to do. A few bags of groceries, a fraction of a tank of fuel, one minor utility payment, and most of that crisp green paper has dissolved into the air. This quiet, persistent feeling of erosion is spreading across the United States, even as the official economic machinery insists that everything is running precisely on schedule. The disconnect is not just a statistical anomaly, it is a profound psychological and financial gulf. According to the ledger sheets of Washington, the American economy grew at an annual rate of 2.1% in the first quarter of 2026, and the national unemployment rate hovered at a stable 4.2% in June. On paper, these are the coordinates of a healthy, functioning machine. They are certainly not the redline numbers people associate with a systemic crash or a historic depression. Yet, underneath this veneer of macroeconomic stability, the tectonic plates are grinding. Workers are watching their weekly hours quietly shave down. Younger adults are moving back into their childhood bedrooms or relying on monthly family cash transfers just to stay afloat. Renters find themselves paying significantly more for less square footage, while aspiring home buyers discover that even when sellers blink and lower their asking prices, the math of modern mortgage rates means their actual monthly payments remain completely out of reach. The engine of the American economy is moving forward, but the exhaust is choking those at the back, and the pressure is not being shared evenly if you spend even a few minutes looking past the sanitized headlines. You will find an entire nation of people describing an economy that feels completely alien to the one celebrated on cable news. There is a deep structural friction occurring at the ground level. Take the independent contractor who recently noted that his older, wealthier clients still expect home renovation projects to cost what they did in 2019, completely blind to the fact that the price of copper wiring, drywall, and basic labor has fundamentally shifted to a new, permanent baseline. Or look at the licensed plumber in Texas who logs onto forums to ask why his phone has suddenly stopped ringing, wondering if the slowdown is isolated to his specific suburb, his company's marketing, or if it is a silent frost creeping across the entire service industry. Then there is the mid-career professional looking for a new apartment after a divorce or a relocation, staring at local rental listings in utter disbelief because they had been insulated by a fixed 30-year mortgage for a decade and are only now realizing that the baseline cost of shelter has doubled while they weren't looking. None of these isolated stories, on their own, prove that the American financial system is on the verge of a catastrophic breakdown. But when thousands of these identical narratives begin to converge from entirely different geographic regions, industries, and social classes, they demand a deeper investigation. Why are so many people arriving at the exact same grim conclusion from completely different corners of the country? The answer lies in a fundamental structural truth. National economic indicators and personal financial experiences are measuring two completely different realities. Gross domestic product is a measure of aggregate velocity. It tells us how much money is changing hands and how much the nation is producing, but it says absolutely nothing about who gets to keep the surplus. The unemployment rate tells us what percentage of the population is actively filling out applications without success, but it remains entirely blind to whether those who are employed are actually earning enough to survive. Neither of these metrics accounts for the devastating math of non-discretionary inflation. The reality of how much of a worker's paycheck is immediately devoured by fixed overhead like rent, auto insurance, groceries, childcare, and basic electricity before they have a single dollar left to save, invest, or spend on their own terms. This is why two citizens can look at the very same economic landscape and see two entirely different countries. A homeowner who locked in a 3% mortgage rate in 2020 feels insulated, wealthy, and secure. They are living in a golden era of asset appreciation. Meanwhile, a first-time buyer staring down a 7% interest rate on a home that has appreciated 50% in 5 years looks at the exact same neighborhood and sees a locked gate. Both of their experiences are entirely real, because in the modern economy, your financial truth is no longer determined by how hard you work, but by the exact calendar year in which you secured your baseline costs. To understand how the American balance sheet became so fragile, we have to look past the immediate shock of the post-pandemic years and examine a 15-year macroeconomic experiment. The crisis of today is the direct mathematical consequence of decisions made in the wake of the 2008 financial collapse. For more than a decade, the Federal Reserve maintained a policy of near-zero interest rates, effectively making the cost of borrowing money free for financial institutions, large corporations, and wealthy investors. This prolonged era of cheap credit did not lead to a massive surge in manufacturing or wage growth for the working class. Instead, it flowed directly into assets. Stocks, real estate, and corporate debt swelled to unprecedented valuations. By the time the global pandemic arrived in 2020, the financial system was already highly leveraged and deeply dependent on continuous monetary intervention to survive. When the global economy paused in March 2020, policymakers did not simply cushion the blow, they flooded the engine. The Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet by more than $4 trillion in a matter of months, purchasing government debt and mortgage-backed securities to keep the credit markets from freezing. At the exact same time, the federal government distributed trillions of dollars in direct stimulus payments, expanded unemployment benefits, and forgivable loans to businesses. While these measures prevented an immediate catastrophic depression, they introduced an astronomical volume of new currency into circulation, without a corresponding increase in the supply of actual goods, services, or housing. The laws of supply and demand responded with mathematical predictability. Too many dollars began chasing too few physical resources, triggering the steepest inflationary spike in 40 years. This surge in liquidity intersected with a massive, spontaneous geographical shift that turned several regions of the country into economic traps for their own residents. Armed with remote work contracts and liquid cash from high-cost coastal real estate markets, hundreds of thousands of buyers relocated to the Sunbelt. Cities like Austin, Phoenix, Tampa, and Nashville saw an unprecedented influx of out-of-state capital. The local real estate markets in these destinations were completely unprepared for the sudden demand. In Austin, Texas, the median home price surged by more than 40% in less than 2 years. Local workers, whose wages were tied to the regional economy rather than Silicon Valley or Wall Street benchmarks, suddenly found themselves priced out of their own neighborhoods. This migration pattern created a distinct geographic trap. The influx of wealthier residents drove up the cost of everyday services, local taxes, rent, and insurance. However, the local infrastructure and average wages did not rise to meet the new cost of living. A school teacher, a paramedic, or a municipal worker in these booming metro areas faced the reality of a coastal cost of living funded by a traditional regional paycheck. The very workers required to keep these rapidly expanding cities functioning could no longer afford to live within an hour of their workplaces, while individual buyers were competing for suburban homes. An even more powerful force was quietly reshaping the housing market. Institutional investors, backed by the virtually free capital of the previous decade, realized that single-family rentals represented a highly lucrative, inflation-resistant asset class. Corporations like Invitation Homes, Tricon American Homes, and Progress Residential began buying up starter homes in bulk. In several major metropolitan suburbs, corporate buyers accounted for more than 30% of all single-family home purchases in 2021 and 2022. They did not buy these properties to flip them, they bought them to hold them as permanent rental stock. By targeting the lower price segment of the market, these institutional buyers effectively removed the entry-level inventory that young, working-class families historically relied on to build generational wealth. By the time the Federal Reserve realized that inflation was not temporary, the damage to the underlying price structure was already done. In response, beginning in March 2022, the central bank embarked on the most aggressive interest rate hiking campaign in modern history, raising the federal funds rate from near zero to over 5.25%. This sharp upward shift was intended to cool the economy by making credit expensive, thereby reducing demand. In a traditional cycle, higher interest rates are supposed to force asset prices down as buyers lose purchasing power. In the housing market, however, the rate hikes produced an entirely different, highly dysfunctional result. because millions of American homeowners had locked in fixed-rate mortgages at 3% or lower during the pandemic boom. They faced a massive financial disincentive to sell their homes. Listing a home and buying a new one meant trading a 3% mortgage for a 7% mortgage, a decision that would add hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars to their monthly expenses for the exact same level of housing. As a result, the supply of existing homes for sale evaporated. This lack of inventory kept home prices artificially elevated, even as mortgage rates reached heights not seen in 25 years. First-time buyers were caught in a brutal vise. They had to face both record-high purchase prices and doubled borrowing costs, creating the worst housing affordability index in a generation. The historical path to middle-class stability had been systematically locked from the inside. While the macro-level indicators continue to project a picture of stable growth, the structural reality on the ground is defined by a silent, grinding depletion of liquidity. The average household does not experience the economy as an abstract percentage of GDP. They experience it as a series of non-negotiable monthly transactions. When those transactions consistently outpace wage growth, families are forced to make a series of quiet, desperate adjustments. The first line of defense is usually the depletion of personal savings. During the pandemic, government stimulus and forced lockdowns allowed the personal savings rate to temporarily surge to historic highs. By 2026, those reserves have been completely liquidated. The safety buffers are gone, and households have been forced to transition to a secondary, much more expensive line of defense. High-interest revolving credit. The numbers from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's Q1 2026 household debt report outline the exact dimensions of this systemic trap. Total U.S. credit card debt has climbed to a historic high of $1.25 trillion. What makes this figure particularly dangerous is not just the aggregate balance, but the compounding cost of carrying it. Following the Federal Reserve's aggressive rate hiking campaign, the average credit card interest rate has climbed past 21%, with rates on accounts carrying a balance hovering even higher. This is not a sustainable financial tool, it is a wealth-stripping machine. Borrowers who once used credit cards strictly for convenience or rewards points are now using them to bridge the gap between their paychecks and the rising costs of basic groceries, utilities, and auto repairs. Cardrates.com is show 1. This shift is starting to break the consumer credit system. The flow of credit card balances into serious delinquency, defined as 90 days or more past due, has surged to its highest level in 15 years, matching rates not seen since the immediate aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis. This spike in defaults is not happening because Americans have suddenly become financially reckless. It is happening because their fixed overhead has climbed to a level that leaves no margin for error. Cardrates.com consider the escalating cost of maintaining and insuring a vehicle. For the vast majority of Americans outside a few dense metropolitan centers with robust public transit, owning a car is not a luxury. It is a mandatory prerequisite for employment. Yet, the basic overhead of vehicle ownership has quietly transformed into a major financial liability. Since 2021, the average price of full coverage auto insurance in the United States has surged by more than 40%. By 2026, the national average for a full coverage policy has reached $2,158 per year, with drivers in high-risk or highly litigious states like Florida, Louisiana, and Nevada paying far more. Aftermarket Matters Show 1. This insurance crisis is a perfect case study in how hidden mechanisms drive the cost of living. Insurance companies are not raising rates out of arbitrary greed, they are responding to structural shifts. The cost of vehicle parts and labor surged by more than 36% in the years following the pandemic. Modern vehicles are packed with complex sensors, cameras, and microchips located in vulnerable areas like bumpers and side mirrors. A minor fender bender that once cost $500 to repair now requires thousands of dollars in technical calibration and component replacement. Furthermore, insurance companies are passing down the escalating costs of natural disasters and climate-related claims directly to policyholders. The consumer is caught in the crossfire of these macroeconomic realities, paying hundreds of dollars more each year simply to legally drive to work. InsuredBetter.com, at the exact same time, other forms of non-housing debt are compounding the pressure. Total outstanding auto loan debt has crept up to $1.69 trillion in the first quarter of 2026, indicating that consumers are taking on longer, more expensive loans to purchase vehicles that are depreciating assets. Additionally, student loan borrowers are facing a harsh return to reality. Following the expiration of the pandemic-era payment pauses and subsequent grace periods, federal student loan defaults have steadily returned to pre-pandemic baselines, with serious delinquency rates for student loans climbing past 10% in early 2026. Federal Reserve Bank of New York. This convergence of debt and rising baseline costs has created a sharp clash of forces between large corporate entities and the average consumer. To protect their margins in a slowing market, major corporations have increasingly relied on algorithmic pricing and the introduction of structural fees. From airline ticket surcharges to convenience fees on rental payments, the true cost of participating in the modern economy is rarely the price printed on the tag. Grocery chains, having consolidated over decades of mergers, maintain high prices even as their own supply chain costs stabilize. Knowing that food consumption is completely inelastic, this is the shadowy side of the modern economic landscape. While official retail sales figures can appear healthy because consumers are spending more total dollars, the actual volume of goods being moved is flat or declining. People are paying more to receive less, artificially inflating the top-line revenue numbers of corporations while systematically draining their own household wealth. The consumer is essentially running on a treadmill that keeps accelerating. They are working more hours, earning technically higher nominal wages, and yet finding themselves mathematically further behind than they were 5 years ago. The structural architecture of the modern American economy has developed a profound defect. It has become incredibly expensive to simply exist.